Welcome everyone to When the Bitterroots Beckon, a conversation with Maxim Luskatov and DJ Lee. My name is China Reavers, and I'm here on behalf of the Montana Book Festival, which we wouldn't have been able to do this year without the Whitefish Review and our other sponsors. We're really excited to welcome Maxim and DJ to this year's virtual festival. But first, I want to take care of a little housekeeping. We'd like to welcome you as attendees to submit your questions to our authors via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Lauren Smith is on hand to read questions and pass them along to Maxim and DJ and help facilitate conversation. Rest assured, we are seeing you. Feel free to use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves while the event is taking place. Lauren will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat for questions. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our authors. Maxim Luskatov is the critically acclaimed author of the story collection Come West and See. His stories and essays have appeared in numerous periodicals, including the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Plowshares, and the Southern Review. He lives in, Western Montana. DJ Lee holds an MFA in creative nonfiction and a PhD in 19th century literature. She is Regents Professor of English at Washington State University, where she teaches creative writing and literature. Her creative work includes over 30 nonfiction pieces in magazines and anthologies, and her hybrid memoir, Remote, Finding Home in the Bitterroots, which was named by the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association as one of 7 of the most anticipated new books of 2020, and took first place in the Idaho Writers Guild 2020 contest. Lee has also written or edited 7 books on the environment, 19th century literature, and oral history, most recently, The Land Speaks. She has received a National Endowment for the Humanities Collaborative Research Grant, an Idaho Humanities Grant, the Charles A. Reiskamp Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Suzanne M. Glasscock Humanities Book Prize for Interdisciplinary Scholarship, and the Arctic Circle Artist Residency. She has also attended workshops as an instructor or participant at the Johns Hopkins University Conference on Craft and Science Writing, Hedgebrook, and the Women's Studio Workshop. Okay, I'll let you two take it away.
Thank you so much, China and Lauren and DJ as well. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be a part of the Montana Book Festival in this new form. I know this moment in time, it's easy to feel very isolated. So it's really beautiful to be able to share work and have these kinds of conversations, reaching out not just to people here in Montana, but all over the country and the world. And along those lines, I really would encourage you, if you have questions, anything that kind of pops into your mind as DJ and I are talking, please don't hesitate to fire away. It's a really nice way of feeling like there are people out there. You know, the hardest part of these presentations is I'm here in my little writing studio and I start to feel like I'm talking to myself. So yeah, please don't hesitate to ask us anything that's on your mind. And I guess along those same lines, I want to just start by kind of acknowledging the moment we're in and how apt it feels to me to be having this conversation focusing around the Bitterroots right now. Because one thing that it feels like is happening in the world is we're being forced to reckon with place in an entirely new way. You know, I know that some people out there who are watching are in Oregon or California or Washington, you know, places that are experienced really devastating fires this year. We're all experiencing a pandemic that has cut down on our ability to travel, to move around in the ways that we used to take for granted. And all around us are kind of myriad ways in which we are becoming, I think, more connected to the place where we are. You know, it's becoming harder to leave, and it's also harder to take it for granted. You know, it feels like wherever you are in the country right now, the natural world is knocking on the door and saying, remember, here I am. And so it's really it's beautiful to be able to talk about the Bitterroot Valley and the Bitterroot Mountains in particular today, because the reason I was first drawn to that place is because for me it feels like probably the clearest microcosm of the modern West and the dichotomies of the modern West. And yesterday I went to Lake Como, which is a place that on sort of the southern edge of the Bitterroot Valley, and it figures pretty prominently into my book. And when you sit in the middle of that lake on a boat, when you look to the east, you see this sort of untrammeled splendor of the Bitterroot Mountains, and they just look indestructible and magnificent. And you're looking up this canyon into this vast, vast wilderness, part of the largest roadless wilderness in the lower 48. Then if you turn around and look to the west, the other side of the lake is dammed. It's a big sand embankment. You can see where the lake level should be versus where it is. You can see the spillway and the drainage, and it's it's completely human intervention. And for me, that is the power of the Bitterroot Valley. It's this place of massive uh, and sort of undaunted natural beauty and power and strength. And I know DJ's book, it's a place you can get lost and never be found. Like it's one of those places that are still out there in the world like that. At the same time, it's growing. All the towns are growing, people are moving in. Really rich people are moving to the stock farm club that Charles Schwab has. Really poor people are living in trailers on the edges of the towns. And so there's these same kinds of dichotomies that are happening in the communities there. Um, and yeah, along those same lines, like, right now in this moment of isolation and kind of massive transformation that is happening in the world through a lot of different kinds of suffering, one thing that I'm finding in it is that there is there's an opportunity for a new sense of clarity and purpose. And the form that's taken for me is finding out what it is that I have to say, and then learning how to listen to the things that I don't have to say. For too long in this country, we've had a few people who talked about everything and they didn't know what they were talking about most of the time. And so for me, what's become really clear in my work and as an artist and just as a human being is growing up in Montana, I was given the great gift of having access to the power of nature in its sort of pure form. And so the feeling for me of walking through a wilderness like the Bitterroot at night under the stars, and how small you feel and yet how big at the same time, how much a part of everything you feel is what I feel like I have to convey almost more than anything else. And that's a huge part of Ruthie's journey in the book. And at the same time, we're not only fighting right now for the environmental health of our country, we're fighting for the soul of our country through the Black Lives Matters movement and the history of racial inequality that's being reckoned with at the same time. And so in that arena, I feel like my purpose is very much to listen and to be an active listener and participate in every way I can. And so again, that's sort of the feeling I have in this moment, is that every person has something that they know in this intimate way that they can share with others. And in this moment of kind of isolation and of having to step back from the world, it feels like an opportunity for each of us to find that voice and share it in however we can, and then also to listen to the many other voices around us. And so I'm going to read just a little bit from Ruthie Fear. And as I mentioned, sort of the arc or the trajectory of this entire book is really, it's the story of a woman in the Bitterroot Valley who's witnessing the place change around her. And she's witnessing sort of the end moments of a certain type of masculinity that I think has dominated the West for far too long, and that all of the mythology of the West is based on. And it's this mythology of taking, of coming west and taking land from the Native Americans, taking animals from the hills, taking trees from the woods. And we've reached a point where there isn't so much left to take. And so suddenly all these collisions are happening between people, and a new way of being in the world is really needed, particularly in these landscapes and in places like the Bitterroot Valley. And so the book begins when Ruthie is a little girl and she's born with this innate connection to nature, and a connection in a deep way, and that she sees things that other people don't see. And she's not sure if they're real or not because everyone else tells her they're not real. And as she gets older, she starts to lose that connection and she gets kind of sucked into the world of men. And the arc of the book is really her trying to find her way back, and trying to find her way back to these sort of visions and the beauty that surrounded her as a little girl. And so I'm going to read from the second chapter of Ruthie Fear, which takes place when she's 5 years old. The first time Ruthie Fear went hunting with her father, she saw a huge winged skeleton flying in from the north. It approached over the dawn-lit mountains, wings stretched across the horizon, undulating on currents of air. Each bone rose and fell discreetly, hinged together like vertebra and marked by shafts of light. The skull pointed toward her. Its shadows slid over the earth. An alien, Ruthie was sure. Some creature that glided from world to world on gravitational tides and had died in between, the heat of 1,000 suns slowly stripping away its flesh. Only 5, she felt the vastness of the universe, saw herself as a single dot. Imagined skimming through the cosmos beside this hunter, without fear or hunger, passing strange worlds and towering nebulae of green and purple gas, millions of miles across. Her father's Auto 5 shotgun broke her reverie and shattered the skeleton into a mass of flapping, twisting parts. One tumbled down to the ice-covered pond before them. It landed silently in a puff of snow. The rest of the flock reassembled, carried on, and were lost in the shadow of the Sapphire Mountains. Her father cursed and lowered the gun. White frost clung to his red beard. Pulled too early, he said. His orange cap was the brightest piece of the morning world. Ruthie struggled to understand. One moment the skeleton, the next a dying goose. Smoke threaded up from the gun barrel and a mirror of her father's breath. The goose dragged itself across the ice with a broken wing, making not for the shore but the center, as though it would be met there in safety by a healing force. The cold air stung Ruthie's throat. Sudden warmth ached behind her eyes. She mourned the loss of the winged skeleton much more than the goose dying in front of her. The impossible distances it had crossed, the freedom to move from galaxy to galaxy, feeding on light, while her own life was confined to the trailer she shared with her father and the valley that surrounded them. The goose collapsed. Only its unbroken wing continued to beat weakly against the ice in steady, desperate cadence. Her father cursed again. He breached the stock and emptied the spent shells into the snow. Gunpowder's acrid ammonia smell wafted out. Point away, he said, handing Ruthie the shotgun. Not at me, not at you. Ruthie gripped the warm barrel to her chest. She wished the skeleton had passed overhead, that it had streamed on to Las Vegas or Cancun or one of the other exotic places populated by bikini-clad women on the posters on her father's bedroom wall. He was only 24, not much more than a child himself. He turned and picked his way down through the brush to the edge of the pond. He paused on the shore, his eyes narrowed against the cold, his eyebrows drawn together in determination. Never do this, he said. He lay down on his stomach and spread his arms, paused there for a moment, a supplicant flattened with his chin to the snow, then pushed off the snowy bank with his legs and slowly pulled himself over the creaking surface by the elbows. His arms in a crooked V above his head, his body flat, one ear cocked to the shifting sounds beneath. Heat seemed to ribbon off him, an invader on the blank white void, only the goose also moving within it. The wing beat like a heart, whomp, 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 slowing, failing, a bloody motor running down. A trickle of red reached out to meet her father, to guide him as a serpent to its lair. Ruthie wanted to scream, but she was afraid even that sound would crack the ice. She held her breath. Her father inched farther out, 10 feet from the shore, 20. His gloved hand reached for the bird's black foot, nearly touched it, when a sound like another gunshot split the morning, and two white walls tipped up to form a canyon, sluicing both man and bird into the dark water below. Then flopping back to horizontal, only the jagged vein between the sheets revealing the break. For a moment, Ruthie did not move nor scream. She was trapped between reality and her imagination. What had been real? Her father on the ice or lost in the dark water below? The flying skeleton or the flock of geese? Her booted feet in snow or skimming along beside a huge winged creature in the black of space? The ice violently upended into a mountain and her father's orange hat burst forth. Icy water gushed off his cheeks. He howled. His arm thrashed free from the water, holding the struggling bird by the feet. He flung it toward Ruthie. It skidded into the snowbank on the shore. It looked oddly unharmed there, only dazed, with all the blood washed from its feathers and its wound temporarily frozen shut. Rutherford brought his elbows down onto the ice, breaking it again. He twisted his shoulders like a bear and lurched toward Ruthie. She stood frozen in terror, holding the shotgun. His approach was relentless, smashing through the ice in the waist-high water, his face contorted. Monstrous, beastly, a killer who would kill again. For an instant, she was so afraid that she thought to level the barrel to her father's chest, pull the trigger, and send him back beneath the ice. Seal it above his head, the massive skeleton once again, winging south across the sky. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maxim. I remember reading that chapter and how powerful it was, just like reading it. So it was just really wonderful to hear you read it aloud. And that chapter resonates throughout the entire book. So I won't give any other spoilers to people who haven't read it yet. So yeah, I definitely echo what you said about this moment being this sort of fulcrum, this threshold. And as you heard from my introduction, I've been a historian, a literary and oral historian for, I don't know, like 30 years now. And I feel like there are these, historical turning points, but I also feel like every moment is a turning point. Every moment has this kernel of change in it. And those moments that resonate with you are, sometimes the moments that you do want to turn into art or take further. So one of those moments happened for me when I was in my 30s. My grandmother was dying. She was 91 years old, and she gave me a box filled with newspaper articles and documents and diaries and photographs. And she passed on. And so, being an archivist, I thought of this box as an archive. I did open it. I opened the lid and saw that everything in that box pertained to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, which to that point in my life, I'd heard just a little bit about. I'd heard the name once or twice growing up as a child, but I knew nothing about. I grew up in Seattle. So like I said, as an archivist, I knew that was going to take me on a journey, and I really didn't want to go on that journey. So I left it shut for 5 years. I didn't even open it again. I knew there were secrets in my family. There were mysteries that I really wanted them to just stay missing and stay lost and stay buried. But finally, about 5 years after she was gone, I opened it, and every single thing, pointed to the Selway Bitterroot, and I felt as if she was reaching from beyond the grave and asking me to explore that place, my family history and the history of the Selway Bitterroot. I ended up going into the Selway Bitterroot and into the, hanging out in the Bitterroot Valley, both, on the Montana side, but also coming in through Idaho many, many times over 15 years, backpacking in, taking horse and mule, flying in on bush plane, or just camping along one of the kind of semi-remote roads in there. I opened, I got access to archives all over the country that had documents about the Selway Bitterroot. I did oral history interviews with over 50 people who had worked in there or lived in there through the years. And ended up writing a book about it. And then in 2018, when I was almost finished with the book, one of the people who I'd interviewed was a woman named Connie Saylor Johnson, and she really helped me navigate that land, not just physically. She was kind of a role model to me as this longtime wilderness ranger, but also psychologically and intellectually. We had many, many conversations about what the place means. And spiritually, she was a very spiritual person. So just as I was, kind of wrapping up the manuscript, she went missing. And some of you listening may know her story because it was really, it became a big deal in the Bitterroot Valley, and then also on the Idaho side. That was in October 2018. And so my book is, it's basically has 3 journeys in it. It has my own journey to try to piece together this history, the family history, and the larger history of the wilderness, and going back to even before the Nimipu and the Salish, like to the geologic history. And it's also, my journey to try to come to terms with Connie's disappearance. So I'm going to read, and it's 34 chapters, 34 short chapters. So I'm going to read chapter 20. And it takes place at a trailhead on the Idaho side called Gedney Creek. But I'm also thinking about another trailhead called the Fog Mountain Trailhead. And this took place like just a few weeks after Connie went missing. And I drove there and camped there by myself. I'd camped there by myself many times, but I started to get spooked. And I wanted to go to Fog Mountain Trailhead so I could at least, be a little closer to the place where Connie disappeared, which was Big Rock. So, yeah, and just to say that actually, I didn't realize it until it was published, but my book has a lot of trailheads in it. And I kind of think of them as like portals, liminal spaces between, wilderness and civilization, isolation and community, remoteness and intimacy, past tense and present tense, because my book is nonlinear, so it weaves between different timelines. And this world and the spirit world, sort of places of entry and mystery. Okay, so this chapter is called Deep. It's short, and it has a date on it, October 20th, 2018. Connie told me once, my very first trip into the Selway Bitterroot, I stopped at every bridge on Highway 12. I walked across those bridges and watched the water. When I got to the wilderness, I stopped at every pack bridge. I was in awe of everything. I crossed the bridge at Split Creek and touched a western red cedar, and it felt like angel's wings. But tonight at the Gedney Creek campsite, I go to bed with an axe. When all but a few embers glow from the fire pit, I head for the tent, dragging the lumberjack's favorite tool. A cottonwood rattles. The moon projects branches as playful fingers against the nylon tent. Angel's wings? The branches outside my tent don't feel like angels. They're menacing. Cougars, bears, and wolves creeping through the forest cross my mind. and strange people lurk in the corners. Strange, like James DiMaggio, who in 2013 abducted a teenage girl in California, shot her mother and brother, and drove to the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness, which borders the Selway Bitterroot to the south. The national news, which I followed with fascinated horror, focused on, quote, remote Idaho, on how the FBI took 3 hours to hike a few miles through the mountains. One officer was quoted as saying, "There's nothing out there," meaning nothing human made, as if he'd never imagined such a place. After the girl was rescued, another officer speculated that DiMaggio had had a mental breakdown, noting the incongruity of his taking a gray house cat into the wilderness. A friend of mine once told me, "I've seen some sketchy people at the Fog Mountain trailhead." I've met sketchy people at trailheads too. A boy with a hollow face who'd watched Into the Wild too many times and was living his own Alexander Supertramp story, carrying a thin bedroll, not a proper sleeping bag or tent, a few miles from Race Creek. When I came upon him, he was sitting on a log next to a dead squirrel and a rattlesnake he'd shot with his .22. I was shocked at how skinny and unprepared he was in his torn cotton trousers. When I offered gummy bears and trail mix for my pack, he devoured them. But the deeper into the woods you went, the more strangers seemed like family. Once I was backpacking with my daughter Steph, who was 16. In shorts and strappy yoga tops in the thick and swampy air, we padded along a trail, sweat beading our noses, dodging an army of insects, the anticipation of reaching Fish Lake Saddle and rushing down to the cool lake, driving us on. At our halfway point, Steph's cheeks were burning, her eyes glazed. We tramped on until she said, "I need to rest." We stopped, biting flies ravaging our skin, mosquitoes joining in, panic rising. I had been rationing our water, limiting us to small sips, but I used some of our precious supply to wet a handkerchief and tie it around her neck. The flies were one scourge too many, and I silently cursed myself for putting my daughter in danger. I didn't want to show how worried I was. And then there appeared 2 men on horses leading a mule team, the only people we'd encountered all day. I looked up longingly. They were dressed in long pants and long-sleeved shirts to shield themselves from insects. The large horses were drenched with sweat, the men's faces dirty. A musty smell filled the air. Steph and I stood staring at the wild, sideways eyes of the horses. The men had guns strapped to their belts. I studied my hiking pole, a paltry weapon. My knife was buried in my pack. An image flashed before me of my phantom self screaming hysterically, "Leave her alone, take me instead," and the men rolling their eyes and riding away. Steph and I were already shuttled off the trail, knee-deep in a thicket of waxy-leaved bushes, when one of the men, with stubbled skin and dark shadows under his eyes, reached into his pocket for something and threw it at me. By the time I figured out what it was, a full bottle of insect lotion, the men were gone, slipped through the ether to some cowboy dimension. I smothered Steph's skin with lotion, rubbing tenderly, then slathered some on myself, and we hiked on, insects hovering, but keeping their distance. Safe in my tent, axe by my side, I snuggle farther into the bag. Connie couldn't have encountered someone menacing because she was too deep in the woods. Deep is where people take care of one another, even if, like the cowboys, it's an act of generosity with a hint of contempt. The sleeping bag rubs against my ear, amplifying my breath. My feet are ice cubes. I stuff a blanket and down coat into the bottom, waiting for warmth. Something's prowling around close to my ear on the other side of the nylon. Light footsteps, thwack of hooves. I lie perfectly still, and the prowling turns to trickling water and stirring leaves. I try to feel Connie's kindly presence in the wind and the shadows, yet all I can do is dream up the way she might have survived. She could have crawled in a hole and covered herself with subalpine fir branches. Those trees can save your life. Ace the dog could have kept her warm, alive, or she could have encountered the cowboys with the lotion or some relative of theirs who brought her to their camp, restored her, and were even now on their way to town. Into the night, I toss and turn, crashing between dream and dread. The hidden world, often glimpsed before sleep, permeates the tent. Finding it impossible to engage my rational mind, I click on my headlamp and run out, dragging my axe and sleeping bag. Inside the car, I fold the seats down and lock the doors, but even then, I feel scattered because no one knows for certain about the other realm, land of pixies, sylphs, willis, protectors of women and preservers of environments, genial wood spirits who can also be angry, especially if they didn't want to die. And yes, we would love to have your questions as we have our conversations about the place that hopefully all of you love and that we love, the Bitterroots.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's such a beautiful section. And I think it perfectly kind of encompasses something that is part of both our books and is part of how I feel so often when I'm in the Bitterroots, which is this, and which I love, the closeness of beauty and menace, and reality and spirit and vision. And I would like to just kind of jump in right away and ask you about kind of ghosts and spirits and that kind of thing, because I know for me in writing Ruthie Fear, it more than anything I've ever written, it felt like an act of less of writing and more of just like being a conduit for a voice that was speaking through me. And in my experience I never intended to write a novel. I didn't intend to write a novel even. You know, I had written short stories and I thought I was a short story writer, and didn't intend to write about the Bitterroot Valley. I wrote a short story that was supposed to be about guns. It was supposed to be kind of a parable for gun violence and in America, and the main character just kept talking to me for years. And so I'm curious, because so much of your book is about you know, people, things like things that are lost in this, in one of these last like vast and truly wild places. And I'm curious if in your journeys, you know, I think it's interesting with the police officer, you know, people saying there's nothing out there. My experience often when I'm in the woods, particularly in a place like the Bitterroot, is I don't feel alone at all. You know, I feel so surrounded. And so I'm curious, because I think, you know, first of all, because you were having the experience of explicitly looking for a person and for, you know, history of your family, and also having this great well of knowledge about the people and the geology. So yeah, I wonder if you could speak to just sort of how you feel in those situations and what it felt like going into the woods, you know, kind of seeking spirits.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also noticed that the way our books dovetailed with the sort of the spiritual aspect and the spirits that haunt the books and that haunt the Bitterroots. You know, to be honest, I am a kind of like a hard-nosed scholar, so I resisted the spiritual aspect quite strongly through a lot of the years that I was back there. I was trying to look at it more scientifically and intellectually, because I didn't want to romanticize it. I wanted it to I wanted to be open to what it had to say to me, but I didn't, I just didn't want to fall into some, just to some kind of narrative about wild places being spiritual places. But it ended up being that way, especially with Connie's disappearance. And then I spent a few years volunteering at Moose Creek Ranger Station, which is one of the oldest and most remote ranger stations left in the country. It's not the oldest, but it's one of the oldest. It's also on a plateau. It's at a confluence of 3 rivers, and the Nimipu, I mean, we're certain that the Nimipu used that spot for camping and gathering and fishing. So there's this kind of there's this spiritual feeling at Moose Creek itself. When I was living in the cabin that my grandparents had lived in back there, and many people have lived in that cabin, I just, I really felt my grandmother's presence there. She was not happy back there, at least according to her diaries. But I just felt like these logs were here witnessing her being here, and they, that so just being contained in that log cabin, in the same cabin that she was the first one to live in that space. So the logs were newly cut right when she and my grandfather moved in there. And it just, I did have this sense of prescience and spirituality back there. Yeah, many times. But I resisted it for a long time. What about you? Did you resist it, or?
Oh, I'm very romantic. I never resisted at all. I'm always like, give me more of the, I think that my, it's true though. I think that when I go into the wilderness, I'm drawn by something romantic, but what I end up feeling is that I'm actually seeing reality clearer, and that where I don't see reality super clear is in the civilized world, if that makes sense. And there's a way in which, when I set out to write this book, and when I think this is something that is probably true of all my writing and will always be true of my writing, is that I always want to create a realist world, but a world in which it feels like literally anything could happen. Because that feels like the truth to me, and that, like in this moment, like if you had told me in January that I would be events, in my studio because we've been shut in for months and months, I never have been able to fathom that. And so something that I really value when I'm deep in the woods is that my sureness of the real is tested, because I feel like that's an illusion that I create, and that a lot of people create, and that a lot of people are struggling with right now. A lot of the things that we thought were going to keep us safe, it's like, no, nature has other plans. And so it's a funny kind of two things that are happening at once often for me when I'm in the wild. Like I am feeling presences and spirits, and I'm thinking about what that rock must have seen over the past thousands of years. But then I also feel like I'm seeing things more accurately than I do in my day-to-day life.
Yeah, there's just, this clarity that comes from being back there. I think it takes about a day, like away from all your tech and everything, and no messages coming, and you're just like, you get dirty, but you like, the dirtier you get, the cleaner you get, type thing. Yeah, it's just really nice. We do have a question. Can you both talk about your research for your books? How did you research? It's interesting that you approach the subject of the Bitterroots from fiction and nonfiction, and both with such detail. Do you want to answer that, Maxim?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my sort of, let me think about that for a moment. A lot of my research and introduction to the Bitterroot Valley was just very human. I grew up here and I grew up hiking there, but never thinking about it too much. There's a way in which something that is in your backyard, you have a hard time seeing clearly. And so I just thought it was this place with beautiful hikes and kind of strange little towns. But then when I was in my 20s, I had a really dear friend, kind of my oldest friend, was working at the Rocky Mountain Labs out there.
Mhm.
And that was kind of my introduction. So I started spending a lot of time out there with him, doing big hikes with him, learning the history of the valley with him, learning how it was the first white settlement, learning that this had been this place that had been inhabited continuously for such a long time and in such a sort of a different way than the way I had learned about or always thought about indigenous people in Montana was moving around a lot,
Mhm.
following herds of bison, the typical like Blackfoot way of life. Whereas in this much more temperate valley, it was a very different kind of culture. And
Mhm.
um, so during that time, my fascination was just I think that for me as a writer, I always kind of trust, or I've learned, it took me a long time, but to sort of trust my brain as its own best editor. There are so many great stories, there's so many great places for stories. I have ideas for stories every day, but a
Mhm.
lot of them I just have to let go of because I can't write every story that I think of. And so I know I've got something good when my brain just keeps coming back to it.
Mhm.
And I just kept coming back to the Bitterroot Valley. And, again, I mentioned this at the beginning. It was something about every time I learned something new about the place, it was like the depth and the complexity just went deeper, both about the wild spaces and about the society that has grown up there. And
Mhm.
so it just turned into this sort of decade long fascination of kind of just sucking up every kind of information I could find, and then, you know, trying to just spend time with the kind of people that I don't usually spend time with, if that makes sense. I think a lot of what I write through is a desire to understand people who make me angry. And so, one of the first characters that I came up with in the book is Ruthie's father, Rutherford, who names her after himself. And um, he's the kind of person I grew up with, the kind of that, you know, a hunter, kind of living in a really dilapidated trailer, um, poaching firewood from the national forest, poaching game from the woods, and the kind of person that when I was a little kid, kind of infuriated me to no end. And and the process of spending years writing about someone, there's no way for me to be angry at them anymore by the end.
Yeah.
He actually became sort of the heart and soul of the book in a way. And so again, another part of the, I guess research. I'm a fiction writer, so it's always kind of a funny question. Was just you know sitting in bars and talking to and just trying to get the texture of the people who live there and get below the sort of stereotypes into the meat of
Mhm.
people who make their lives in this place that for me was a place I went on the weekends to hike.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I did quite a bit of, literal research while I was in archives, and um, like I said, I did all these oral histories with old timers and young people, and but I also, did a lot of research into my family history. I mean, I consider my mom one of my main sources of research, and a reluctant one, because I had to ask her quite a bit about the family, but I couldn't pry too deeply, because I would resist. I might risk her, like, not wanting to say anything. My grandmother was institutionalized, which I talk about in the book. So I went to the Orofino Asylum and I tried to get her records. I hired a lawyer and I still couldn't get them. And then I did a lot of what you did. I volunteered, I hung out with just a lot of people back there, took mule trips with Marge and Mark Tabor, who they're the former caretakers of Selway Lodge. Just met so many great people. One of the main characters in my book, Dick Walker, is a former ranger. He's a bush pilot. He's a former river runner. He knows the Selway. I mean, the Selway runs through his veins. And I spent so much time with Dick. And, you know, in many ways, Dick is the Selway for me. Just the way he thinks and how he feels about it. But then I also did work, you know, because it's a family story, I also did some work into epigenetics and the idea that, you know, things are passed down through our DNA from our families, traumas, but this can also happen on a cultural level. In fact, the kind of constellation work I did originated in Germany after the Nazi occupation, after the Holocaust, and people were trying to work through that, you know, that cultural trauma that, you know, in many ways we're all still working through. There's always another movie or book or something about World War II, but it can exist on a micro level and a macro level. So I feel like I researched from so many different angles. And then I think that's why it took me so long to write this book, is then just feeling the alchemy of bringing all of this together. I mean, it took a while to get those threads going, and like you say, let the ones just disappear that weren't going to be able to add anything to it.
Thank you. Yeah. We've got some wonderful questions coming in. So I'm gonna the first one that came in is a question for me. You mentioned feeling less like someone writing a novel and more like a conduit for the character of Ruthie Fear. Was that sensation exclusive to your experience with Ruthie Fear, or had you felt that way previously as a writer of short stories? And yeah, that's a wonderful, you know, I it's funny to say, but for me, the process of writing is more about clearing a space in my mind than it is about filling in a space. And, you know, people talk about sort of writer's block or you know, periods of not writing and for me, I have long periods of not writing, but it never feels like block. It feels like I'm waiting for something to pass through me, you know. So I definitely I think I consciously, you know, the older I get, the more I just embrace it and sort of consciously think of it as my process of you know, every story I write is my story in some way. When I read it now, when I read Ruthie Fear now, I see so much of myself when I was a child. But as a fiction writer, so often the process of like truly opening myself up to a character is a process of kind of trying to empty myself out in a certain way. And so, um, yeah, I think it's been true in a lot of my work. A lot of my stories start with a place, and then I start going to the place, and then something in that place starts kind of speaking to me, and that's where the story then comes from.
Okay, we have another question. Both of you, we actually have two more questions, so we have to be quick. Both of you expressed the landscape and place through characters, and I wonder if there are other characters of interest to you that would allow you to project the place in a different way, or if you followed one of your current characters in more detail, would it take you to the and the place to a different spot? So, you know, I was talking to someone on the phone the other day. She's like, I'm gonna drive the you know, you know, that, what's it called, the road between the Frank Church and the Magruder. I'm gonna drive the Magruder. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm taking your book, and I'm like, you are in my book, even though you're not in my book. And you know, honestly, there are so many women that I traveled back there with that I couldn't just like write a book about women in wilderness because it was about my grandfather too, and it was about Dick Walker. But I would love to write a book that had that where most of the characters were women, and the men were like just like like the understory or something, and see where that would take me. So that would be where I would go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you know, again, I learned a lot about the book in the process of writing it, and one of the things I learned was that I think I chose Ruthie, or because she is in a certain way an outsider in the valley, and so through her I was able to sort of observe a lot of the different kinds of people in the place, and kind of try to bring in sort of an expansive view of many different kinds of people who live there. Um, but absolutely, the I look at all of my work, you know. I think all of my books are going to be one big book. There are elements of the stories in Come West and See, and characters even that feel deeply connected to the people in Ruthie's world. And I'm working on a new novel right now that revolves around the Unabomber, but the main character passes through the Bitterroot Valley, and there it feels writing to me feels like a kaleidoscope. I think that at the heart of my work is always going to be sort of these questions and this feeling of what it is to be a person in the modern West. And the beauty of all these different characters is the beauty of looking at these questions from so many different angles and learning something new every time. And so, there are, I'm not sure what the number is now, but there are something like 60 or 70,000 people living in the Bitterroot now, and every single one I could write it, would have a different book, and every single one would bring something I would learn so much from. And so, yeah, it's always a difficult part of sticking to a book for me is and I think DJ kind of alluded to this too. You meet someone, you meet a character, and you're like, well, look at this amazing person, I want to follow them. And some of them you just have to let go in the same way that I have to let go of some stories. But yeah, you would absolutely, the Bitterroot the Bitterroot belongs to every person who goes there, and it's different for every person who goes there. And so every story would be very different.
Yeah, that's true. It's hard to find that singular voice, because then you have to exclude so much. You have to make choices. You got to cut, if you want to choose your character. And yeah, I think that's the hardest. I think, structure is really hard in a novel, and I think, or a, memoir, whatever. And I also think that the point of view, who you decide to tell your story, on what point of view, that's another hard major decision. Yeah. We have another one it's kind of a two-part from Lauren Korn. DJ, since you were writing from someone else's memory, how strictly did you feel the need to not fictionalize or romanticize? And then Maxim, yours is, how much of your lived experience of the Bitterroots is part of the book, and how much did you fictionalize the space? I felt constant pressure not to fictionalize or romanticize. Oh my gosh, it was just, and especially because I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher. I'm like, the footnote queen. I don't like make sure I check my quotations 5 times. And so it was just so excruciating for me to to put dialogue in that, I had notes, I keep meticulous notes, but I don't know if it's totally accurate to remember conversations I had with my mother, my grandmother. So that was a really hard thing for me to, I was more on the side of not fictionalizing, like only putting down stuff that I could find a source and cite. And so I had to kind of loosen up. In fact, when right after I started working on the project, I realized I didn't quite have the skills, because even though I'd written like 6 books up to that point and many, many articles, I did not know how to write. I did not know how to let go. I didn't know how to just, get into the flow. And so I went back and got my MFA at a low residency at Bennington, specifically to learn how to write in a write truth in a fictionalized way, but based I didn't fictionalize things, but I had to choose. I had to shape. I had to shape a narrative that excluded things, and so the story feels like my story, but it may not be, my mother's account or my grandmother's or Dick Walker's or any of the other characters. But that is a great question, and I deal with that with my students all the time, and I feel like I can speak from experience when I counsel them.
Yeah, I love that, because for me, I came at it, the progression was sort of the opposite, I guess, or maybe our progression was actually similar. Because when I started writing, it was just pure fiction. I was there was a part of me that I thought maybe by a final draft I wasn't even going to call it the Bitterroot Valley anymore. I was just going to have it called a made up place, because I sort of had this idea of wanting to create just this kind of mysterious Montana, kind of like totemic or symbolic place. And so, the initial places that I made up for the book, like No Medicine Canyon, a lot of the places that Ruthie goes as a little girl are entirely fictional. And, they could exist. There are a lot of mysterious canyons in the Bitterroot Valley. And that was kind of as the book progressed, and this so often happens with fiction, it's like, again, reality is sort of more magical and strange and surprising than anything I can come up with. And so the more I learned about the history of the Bitterroot Valley, and the more weird, conspiracy theories and stories, that anecdotes that people told me from the place, the more I was like, this is way better than the made up thing that I was planning to use. And so it actually sort of, over draft after draft, it became more and more true to the place, to the point that when it was getting copy edited, the copy editor would send me notes. Hey, this place really this distance from there? And I'd be like, oh no, let's get that right. Let's make that a real place. So one of the really pleasurable parts of the later revisions for me were kind of making it a lot, kind of true to the place in a way, and learning, into that process, learning a lot myself.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, yeah, we've got some more questions, and we just got asked if we have a little bit of wiggle room on time. Oh, we do have okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't a question; it was a statement that we have a little, and I can stay a little longer too, if that's all right.
Yeah, I can stay a few minutes longer. From someone named Sue. This is a great question. Recently, environmental regulations have been replaced. How can you relate your characters in place to that issue? I think it's issue. The environmental rollbacks are devastating. Under the Trump administration, it's like when the Bears ears was shrunk, I just was like sick, like literally sick. Some of my characters, are very, very upset. The thing that is so important though about the Wilderness Act is that every single little piece of wilderness that's added to the wilderness preservation system, which is now over 5% of the US, is that every piece is an act of Congress. So if they wilderness legislation is the hardest thing to roll back, because every little segment would be an act of Congress. It would have to go through Congress. And so maybe you could reduce it a little bit. There's only been a couple of rollbacks of wilderness in the whole history since 1964. Of course, the wilderness isn't perfect. It's a constructed environment. It displaced many Native Americans. It's, it's not perfect, but for me, I think it is as close as we can get right now. And I just love that you couldn't just wipe away all the wilderness in the US. You could just do maybe little segments of it at a time. And even then you would have to have big buy-in from all stakeholders. It would just be a huge process. So my characters, my real people, most of them are really upset about the environmental rollbacks of the current administration. And they fight. I mean, Dick Walker still flies for wilderness advocacy groups and testifies in Congress, testifies for caribou habitat and snowmobile trespass. And, they've worked all their lives to help preserve these spaces, which, Gary Snyder said the reason we have them is for wild animal habitat and wild plant habitat. That's why they exist. Other people like the guy who used to run the Carhart Institute just said there's or the Leopold Institute, I should say, there are just spiritual values in the wilderness that we don't even know about. We humans can't even fathom at this point in our evolution of our species. So there are all kinds of reasons why wilderness as legislation is, I love it. I love thinking about it, and I love the places, and yeah. So how would you answer that, Maxim?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, if there was a central purpose or hope I have for the book, I mean, I think the whole book for Ruthie and for me is sort of a howl of what she sees and what I've seen in my life of natural places being overtaken, and there is nothing that feels more important to me in my writing, and I think that Ruthie's journey through this book is feeling that incredible connection to a wild place, losing that, and then through incredible strife and in a very sort of painful way reclaiming it. And I think that's sort of what we're faced with. And I also though want to definitely echo what DJ is saying, that we're still so lucky in this country with how much wilderness we have, with how well it's protected. And there are things that can be done on the federal level, but a lot of it comes down to the local level. And so again, there are so many things that I look at as sort of an opportunity or a rallying cry, and particularly in a place like the Bitterroot, which is the demographics of it are changing so quickly and so strangely. There's wealthy people moving in, there's survivalists moving in, there's this huge, people who don't agree on anything. But I think that we all, as artists, as writers, whatever we're doing, have a role to play in getting across the point of just how important wild places are and how their value can't be measured, because it's invaluable, it's immeasurable what they do for humans, just on a full body level when you're out there. And so to go back to the question, there's really nothing that is more important to me than that.
It's such a weird contradiction, though, if you think about it, because the wild places, a lot of them are hard to access, and not very many people use them. I mean, that's one draw about them. except for places, like Yellowstone or the Sierras or whatever. But even then, it's still the amount of land to people is very small. But you need this mass support in order to maintain them, and so it's one of those strange contradictions.
Yeah, and it's one of the, the amazing things that the there have been a lot of incredible accomplishments in conservation in this country, and one of the things I'm always struck by is the Forest Service. I don't know who the way things are structured is to get most people all going to the same place. When you go
Yeah.
to Glacier, everybody's up there on Logan Pass and they're getting their fix. They're like, oh my God, this is so beautiful, blah, blah. But I always want to whisper, if you hike,
Yeah,
there's
right.
like hundreds of miles of this and
Yeah,
it gets even better. And so I think that's, again, a sort of an accomplishment that we have in this country, that we have some places that are really accessible, that a lot of people can go and they can feel that majesty and that connection. And then we have some places that are just vast and that you really have to work in to get into, and that are, protecting something, much harder to put into words. I think I'll spend my whole life trying to put what it is they're trying to protect into words. And to go back to that question, that feels like what we need to work so hard to protect, because we're still getting money for our national parks. Even Trump is, understands the value of, the Grand Canyon or something. But we're going to have to work to express and preserve the value of the Bitterroots Selway.
Yeah.
Let's see, there's a couple questions. This one is, for me, is there a difference in mindset and approach when you're working on a novel as opposed to a short story? If so, what does it look like? I think absolutely now. I think I tricked myself into writing this novel by pretending it was a short story for a long time or a series of short stories. And the novel I'm working on right now is the first time that it really feels like I'm writing a novel from the beginning. And the difference for me, and I think it's true sort of in anything you do, the difference between a novel and a short story, it's just how much you're sort of holding up in the air at once. And it felt like the transition between the two was really just a transition in endurance. Like I needed to strengthen these parts of my brain. And maybe DJ, you can relate to that, the difference between writing articles that you publish versus a book. It's the same muscles, but they need to be stronger, because it felt like for years I was holding this whole thing up in the air. And I had tried to write novels before and it crashed down all around me. I was a different person by the time the novel was done. And so when I would read it, the first section was so different from the third. It felt like it was written by two different people. There was no sort of unity to it. And so, the transition for me was a lot about just sort of building up the mental, when I talk about writing, I often end up talking about kind of spiritual or meditative, because it really feels like a process of strengthening the mind and strengthening the space in the mind to hold many voices at once, and opening the mind up to many voices at once. And so that was kind of the motion. And it's funny because now I'm just so excited by novels that because it feels like this great challenge to balance that whole world, that's very much what I'm drawn to at this moment rather than short stories. And it looks like we have one more question for me, and it's, you mentioned striving to write about people who you disagree with, people with very different perspective in politics than yourself. Have you gotten any response from Bitterroot locals, the folks you talked to in bars, those you already knew about the book, and how their lives, lifestyles, beliefs are depicted? I bet this is one you could answer too, DJ. I mean, I think we're both writing about a real place and sometimes about real people. And it's always, there's always a moment where it goes from this, nebulous project that people are excited and curious about to something they can actually hold in their hands and be angry about how they're portrayed. I can't, my book has only been out for about a week, and so um, the I haven't so much yet had the experience this time, but I can speak to what my experience was. My first book was a collection of short stories that was revolved around a fictionalized version of the Malheur occupation in Southeast Oregon. And so it very much had real people and a real place that it revolved around, and who over time after it was out became very aware of it. And what I was really, and I was like genuinely worried more than I am this time, because it's sort of militia type people, I did a reading in Portland, and in the front row, there were like three guys with guns and camo. And in a bookstore, which is, which was a dichotomy in itself. Um, but what I found in that regard that I was really interested in was that the biggest reaction I had was people were just glad to be written about, even though I often don't feel like I'm portraying people in a super positive light necessarily. I work really hard to portray them though as human beings, with the positive and the negatives that we have. And and I mentioned before how much my empathy for them deepens over the course of the book. And the reaction with that book was more people just being grateful to appear in literature at all. I think there are a lot of people in this country from a lot of different kinds of backgrounds who feel super overlooked, and that's as true in the cities as it is out here in Montana. And so, yeah, the surprise for me was even when I was worried, oh gosh, will they be angry? How are they going to feel about this portrayal? The overwhelming response I got was sort of a happiness to be portrayed at all, and um, I think that, for me as a writer, that's also, I know that I have a character who I'm going to stick with. A lot of the process of me going from someone who wanted to be a writer to feeling like I was a writer was feeling like I had stories to tell that hadn't been told yet. And that really started for me when I was in grad school in New York, and I was reading all of this beautiful writing, but none of it was about a certain kind of people I grew up with. And so that's kind of been a beautiful source of strength for me, is feeling like I always have these characters to go back to who I haven't heard from before. And yeah, every person will react to things differently, but again, the experience overall with the first book was mostly, people just being glad that they had been written about.
Oh yeah, well, sounds good.
Well, I just wanted to thank you both. Thank you to Maxim Loskotov and DJ Lee, and congratulations on Ruthie Fear novel and Remote Finding Home in the Bitterroots. Thank you to our sponsors, Whitefish Review, Black Coffee Roasting Company, and Stockman Bank of Montana. And thank you to everyone watching and participating. You've been a great audience. We had a lot of great questions today, so I thank you guys for going a little bit over to answer all of those. I really appreciate that. Just as a reminder, you can purchase books by these authors and many others at Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionbooks.com. I also urge you to purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. There you can also donate so that we can continue our programming after the festival with our MBF Plus events. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.
Yes, thank you, everyone, for spending your evening. Thank you, China, Lauren Korn, and Lauren Smith, too. Thanks, Max.
Yeah, thank you, DJ.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great night, guys. Bye.